Now in this section I'm going to show you how electrophoresis is actually done. So here I've got the basic equipment. I have the power supply, the electrophoresis chamber, the TBE buffer, a gel, eye protection, apron, some dye, and a micropipette. And using this I'm going to show you how to run an example gel. The first thing you'll do is take the top, slide off the top of the electrophoresis chamber, put it over to the side there, and then take your gel and put it in, and you'll see, at least on the ones we have at school, you'll see a black line on the gel tray, and then on the back of the electrophoresis chamber there'll be a small black dot. Now when you put that in there, the wells, I don't know if you can see this with the video, but the wells of the gel should be on the black side of the electrode. And then take it, put that in there with the black to the black and the red to the red, and put that in there. Then take the TBE buffer and slowly pour it in to one side of the container until it's right to the top of your gel. It's just barely coming over the top. Okay? And then do the same thing the other side, pouring in until it's just barely full to the top there. And then pour it in until it's a couple of millimeters above the top of the gel. Now we're going to load the gel, probably one of the more important parts of the process. Now usually if you're using actual DNA, you'll use something that looks like this to hold all the DNA containers. Sitting there, and this is actually hollow. It's the full size of plastic, isn't it? But inside there's a tiny spindle, and the DNA will be held in there. However, for the purposes of this, because we're using food coloring, we have a simple spot plate. Now what you want to do is take your micropipette and set it to the amount of liquid you want, and hold down the plunger, place the tip into the dyes, and pull it up, and release the plunger, and that'll pull the dye back in. Now what some people like to do is they like to kind of wipe off the sides of the tip before they put it in, and so that way you don't end up with a lot of the dye floating around in the gel. So you take that, and I'm going to put this in the second gel, and you just put it in until it's barely past the lip of the gel, and you push down, it'll empty out there. That's a bit much dye, so I'm going to turn this down a little bit. Then you'll push on this blue plastic part right here, and that'll pop off the end of the tip. Get a new clean tip, place it on the end of the micropipette. Do the same thing with the second set. And once again, it's a preference thing, but I don't like to have too many of the gels right next to each other if I don't have to. So instead of putting it in the lane right next to it, I'm going to put this one 2 lanes over. Pop that off. And for this third well, I brought you in nice and close so you can see it in action. I've just filled up the micropipette. I'm going to put, and depending, sometimes you'll still end up with a little plume of food coloring when you put the needle in. Oops, see that fill up there. You want to make sure your micropipette is fully out before you release the button on back. So that way you don't suck it out of the dye you just put into the wells right out. And you see that little plume in there? You want to take the micropipette or a normal pipette and suck all that up. You see I was a little bit slow sucking up these two right here, and it actually stained the gel around the surface before I could suck up all the gel on the outside. And now we're ready to run it. And now we've reached the final and best part, I'd have to say, of this whole process, where the magic really happens, and that's actually plugging it in and running the gel. Now the first thing you want to do is the electrodes on the back of the gel, you want to check and make sure they're dry so that you don't have any problem with the electricity. What you do is you'll take the lid and you'll put it on top, slide it on, and try not to jar it around too much, because if you just sit there and shake it all over the place, you'll end up tipping all that dye out of those gels. And you take, and with this particular power supply, the positive and negative are right above each other. So you just put the red positive into the red positive, and then black negative into black negative. And now this part, it really depends on what you're running. Thing is, you can choose low, medium, or high. The higher you go, the faster it'll run and the less precise your results will be. But the lower you go, the longer it'll take, but your results will be a little bit better to see. Now, for purposes of this, because we're not actually trying to determine DNA size, we're just running actual colored dyes, we're just going to turn it to high. Okay. Now that's there. Make sure the switch is off on the power supply. Plug that in. Then turn it on. And now, I don't know if you can see it from the camera, but the light on the power supply on the switch is just turned on. That's one sign it's working. What you can also do is, if you look in there, you won't be able to see it from the camera, but on the electrodes that run down the sides of the chamber, if you see bubbles starting to develop on the wire, that's a sign that there's electricity running through. And so we're going to let this run for a little while, and as it runs through, eventually the dyes that are smaller molecules will start to separate from the dyes that have larger molecules. The gel will take anywhere from 10 to 45 minutes to run, depending on what you're doing. It may be more or less. Your mileage may vary. So what I would recommend doing in that time is any cleanup you may have, putting away any equipment you're not going to use anymore, like the buffer and the dyes, making sure everything is clean and ready for the next person to use, and other stuff while your gel runs, because you'll have pretty much a lot of free time while the actual gel is running. So any other experiments you may be working on, labs you may have to write up, this is a great time to just do random stuff, because the gel is pretty much, as long as you don't touch it, they're really low maintenance. Just stay away from it, don't hit it too much, because that'll upset it, like we mentioned earlier, and let it run its course. So here we are back again at the gel. Now, this gel has been running for about 30 minutes, and if you can, there's a lot of, what'll happen sometimes is if you let the gel run, a lot of mist will build up on the inside of the apparatus, and so you may have a hard time looking in. And the best way to do it is to look in from the side down there, because it'll still be clear and you'll be able to see it running through. Now with actual DNA, it's a lot harder to see it because they use what's called a loading dye. With the food coloring, it's easy to see the color is shifting through. But with the actual DNA, they'll have a loading dye, and you'll have to be pretty careful to see it and make sure you get it before it comes to the end. We're about 3/4 of the way through this gel, so we're going to just turn this off. And the way it works is, first, you flip the switch on the power supply off, and you let it sit for a few seconds. That way, all of the electricity will finish running through the water and everything, and we'll be good to go. And then disconnect the electrodes from the power supply. And then unplug the power supply. And now it's done running. Now we just have to examine our gel and look at it and see the end result. How we're going to do this is really easy, just taking the gel out. Now you want to make sure that you're really careful, that you don't splash everything all over the place. And you're going to pull and take off the lid just like you did when you first have the stuff ready to use. Now, look in there. When you open it up, you can't really smell through here, but if you ever run anything electrical for a long time, you know that really ozone smell you get? You're going to smell that as soon as you open this thing up. And just reach in. You're going to pick up your tray with your gel inside of it. There we go, and we got some pretty good results there to look at. So we'll take this, and you're done with this, so you can just set this aside over next to your power supply. And what you're going to do when you get rid of that buffer is you're just going to flush it down the sink, pour it out, and that's all you have to do with that. And so let's examine this gel. Now, if you had been running real DNA instead of food coloring, you would have actually had to stay in the DNA so you would be able to see it. However, as it is, we'll be able to just look at it just right. Now, here you can see we had this was green, blue, and red food coloring. This lane was green and red, and this lane was blue and green food coloring. Now, if you look here, it's kind of difficult to see, but if you'll notice, there's red in both of these lanes, and this lane has no red. Now, all of these lanes have blue and yellow because even though this one doesn't have any blue food coloring in it, green actually separates into blue and yellow. And you can tell that yellow is actually the smallest molecule of the food colors because it is farther ahead of the blues and the reds. And the red is smaller than the blue for the same, as you can tell by the same way. It's farther ahead on the run and is running that way, by the way. Now, one thing you'll have in when you're running DNA, the closest lane here on this side is actually going to be a DNA marker, which will be strands of DNA that they've already proven the length of, so that you can run any DNA through, and you'll be able to measure the size of the strands using that marker. And so that's an example of what it looks like to have a DNA run. And the DNA would do kind of the same thing with the smallest strands and getting larger as it comes back towards the back of the gel. And so from this we can tell that blue is the largest molecule, red is the next, is smaller than blue, and yellow is the smallest of them all. And that is how you would run a complete gel.